Hey guys, it's Sam and this is my spoiler-free review for Juniper Thorn by Ava Reid. This is a standalone adult fantasy gothic horror. Technically a retelling of the Juniper Tree fairy tale, but I read the Juniper Tree fairy tale after reading this and I was like, these aren't really close at all. So it has some inspiration, taken inspiration from that fairy tale, which is already dark in and of itself, but this is essentially its own dark fairy tale, gothic horror, inspired by sort of like Eastern European elements. This was also my Patreon book pick for the month, so every month my Patreon supporters get to vote in a poll for a book that I'll read and review. So if you're interested in contributing to my content in that way, I will link the bibliothecary on the screen. This follows the main character of Marlikin. She is the youngest of 3 sisters, and they are all the daughters of the last wizard in this town, this Eastern European town. It's not Eastern European because this is its own fantasy world, but it is very heavily inspired by Eastern European folklore, mythology, and history. And it's in the same world as The Wolf and the Woodsman, which was her first book, but it's during a different time period. But her father was cursed years ago by a witch, which has essentially turned him into a horrible person, although I would say that he's probably a horrible person before. And he doesn't let the daughters do anything and is very incredibly, horribly abusive to them. At the beginning of the story, the daughters sneak out to go see a ballet, and Marlikin does meet the lead ballet dancer, and there's some sparks there, and everything kind of unfolds from there. Again, in a very fairy tale-esque way and structure. Before I get started on this, if you aren't familiar with this book at all, this has heaps of trigger warnings, okay? And all of it is very, very visceral and on page. So if any of these are sensitive to you, I would recommend honestly steering clear of this because this is very in your face. I do not have a lot of real world triggers. As you guys know, I am more freaked out by paranormal stuff. This is all very real stuff, and even this left me uncomfortable while reading it, even though I was fine to read it. So there are triggers for emotional abuse, death of a parent, on-page sexual molestation of a child, just inappropriate sexual behavior with a child, torture and gore, xenophobia and anti-Semitism. The narration does not condone, but is an example of the villainy. Cannibalism, overall controlling relationships, really visceral body horror and self-harm, as well as on-page descriptive depictions of an eating disorder. So yeah, a lot. I think I covered everything. But basically anything that you really could be triggered by has the potential to be in here. And it's a pretty short book. None of this is taken lightly in the story. It is not done to be gratuitous. It is done purely for the horror elements. This book is very much a book that is supposed to make you uncomfortable. There's even, I would say, I wouldn't necessarily call this a trigger, but there is some heavy sexual content in a way that is very descriptive and more of a book that I would describe as erotica, but not, but this is obviously not an erotica book, but that description is juxtaposed with some of the horrific elements to leave you really deeply uncomfortable. Even that's a factor as well. Some of you are probably like, why would I want to read this? It's really well written and it's a horror, it's intended to be that way. So yeah, let's get into it as far as all of the elements and things. So first off, I'm gonna talk about the world building. So this world is in a sort of post-industrial Eastern European inspired world. There were elements of that I didn't necessarily, it didn't register to me, what time period this was, because I would be envisioning one time period and then we would talk about oh, there's running water and there's I think there's cars, trains for sure, and some other little things that I was like, oh, this is in a more modern, I mean not modern as in modern day, but more modern than I thought it was. I was picturing it a little bit more, not quite ancient, but I was picturing a different time period. So there are elements there that didn't quite resonate for me. I think because there's so many fantastical things, particularly in their house. So the atmosphere of the wizard's home, that was visceral. That was, I could see everything. It was such a complete picture. The house is one of the only places that still has magic, and there are monsters in the house and just weird things and his magic, and there's a lot of descriptions of food, and all of that is very visceral. So while there were some parts of it in the general world sense that I didn't necessarily feel resonated a ton necessarily, the elements that were a little bit closer really were easy to picture, for good and for bad. Next, let's talk about our characters. I think the way the characters were done in here was so good for that fairy tale vibe. We have the 3 sisters. The 3 sisters fall into different kind of archetypes. We have the oldest sister as being pretty much a bitch and very abusive. I mean, both sisters are pretty abusive to her in general, but in different ways. The oldest sister is very physically abusive in a lot of ways and just like horrible. The middle sister is more of like the healing sister. I should also say that they all have their own kind of magic. They're all witches. So even like the way that the magic is described, the middle sister is like the herbalist healer. So she has those vibes, but she still does some really manipulative stuff with Marlekin. And then Marlekin has this touching people and getting, she's almost like a touch seer, I think is what they call, I forget what they actually call it, but she can basically touch people and kind of get stories from them and things like that. So she has that power, which again comes into play and can be deeply uncomfortable. So all of them, like, and some of the beats of the fairy tale stuff was really well done and reminiscent of like a more traditional fairy tale. The villains in this story are also very visceral in a way that is not mustache twirling. Like, it definitely was like that creepy horror feeling without being super one-dimensional, but they're awful in all the ways. I typically don't like the characterization of like a villain is a rapist and that's like how we show that he's a villain. All of these characters that do have that element to them also have like other things, so that again it's a little bit more multidimensional than just that, and it's not just using violence against women gratuitously. You can definitely tell that this is written with like women in mind. As far as the love story between her and the love interest, I was hit and miss with that. I don't necessarily think, like, the few horror books that I have read recently, this and Mexican Gothic, there is like this romance element to both of those books, but I'm not necessarily like super drawn to it just because like the suspense and everything else leaves me so unsettled that my brain cannot register into like a romance thing. But their relationship, really good. Talking about like the effects of trauma on both of them and how that impacts their dynamic and just like the support there and everything was really good. And ultimately, like, again, he was so much more multi-dimensional than I originally thought when we first saw him. So all of the characters, whether they were minor characters, whether they're villains, whether they're main characters, felt very fleshed out and real, and just like characters that are existing outside of this story, which is what I always sort of categorize as really good characterization. Lastly, we'll talk about the plot. Dark fairy tale, okay? It follows those beats. This left me uneasy through most of the story. Again, because of all those triggers I talked about, it's such a viscerally uncomfortable experience, but in a good way. As weird as it is to say that, there were definitely like, I was very intrigued about like, how is all this stuff happening, the twists and turns, but then when it all came together and like some of the mystery elements were solved, that was super interesting. The themes and everything of like, basically essentially what makes a monster, because we had these monsters like in the home and her dad is a monster and like all these different villains. What makes someone monstrous, I thought was really cool. Explorations of trauma, really cool. And like just the pacing remained good throughout, and that like slow build up of suspense. I cannot read scary things. This is not scary. It is unsettling. Again, the way that things are written, the way that certain things are described, the way things are repeated, just all of that was done so masterfully as far as like this being a gothic horror story and a dark fairy tale. Ava Reid's writing is beautiful, and this lends itself well here, even though the things she is describing can be horrific. So ultimately, I really liked this. It's weird. It's one of those books that's like, I can't always necessarily say that I enjoyed it, because there were times that I would have to put it down and be like, I am unsettled. This is unsettling, but super well done in every way. A book that will definitely leave its mark. I think it's a 4.5 to a 5-star for me. It's hard to rate a book that has all that shit in it as 5-star, but again, I don't think nothing was depicted in a gratuitous way, in my opinion. And I think if this is a book that you can handle, I would definitely recommend it, but I know it's not gonna be a book for everyone. But with this, and already with The Wolf and the Woodsman, because it was one of my favorite books at the beginning of the year, Ava Reid has solidified themselves as a new favorite author, and I will be picking up pretty much everything that they write. Because if this is how they start writing, and they're only gonna get better from here, can't wait to see it. So comment below, let me know what you thought of Juniper and Thorn. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.